Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with my co host, Anthony Marquetta, and a special guest today, Jason Kyle, to talk about his Arthurian novel, Beyond the Wall, a novel of post Roman Britain. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Excellent,
Fantastic.
and glad to hear it. All right, so let's see here. This came up because I happened to see a Facebook post, and I saw that you and I had similar friend groups, and I decided to invite Jason Kyle on to talk about his new book. Why don't you guide us through it a bit and talk to us about this book, what we can expect, and sort of what makes it special?
Sure. Uh, well, it's a grounded take on the King Arthur legend, not dissimilar from the 2004 Clive Owen movie, but more accurate. Is probably the quickest, easiest way to describe it. So you can expect, I set it in the early 500s, um, and I'm going off of early historical sources, and it's basically the tale of Romano Britons in this period. So you're looking at about 100 years after the Romans pulled out of Britain. It's gone to complete chaos. It's almost it remind reading about that period reminds me of post-apocalypse movies. It's that bad. So this is the story of one warlord just trying to keep the boat from sinking, kind of thing. You know,
Yep. And so, tell us about Peredur and who's the perspective character of this story.
so for this story, Peridor is a young, well, he, by modern terms, he'd be considered a Welshman, although the concept of Wales didn't exist even at this point. But I set him in the island of Anglesey, which is in western England, and he's a young, naive nobleman's son. He's personality-wise, and background-wise, he's very heavily based on the medieval writer Chrétien de Troyes' Percival. My research just led me to believe that the name Peridor, which is a Welsh name, was probably the original source the for the character of Percival. Who, yeah.
Yeah.
So Peridor in my story, he's a 16-year-old kid. He's upper class, um, and but he's still raised in kind of a backwater town. He's a big fish in a little pond, kind of thing. Um, so his brother is killed in one of Arthur's previous campaigns. He wants revenge on the Saxons. So as soon as he's old enough, he sneaks off and joins Arthur's men, which for my story, um, Arthur's not a king, he's a military commander. Since we're talking about the 500s, this is a period before knights. The concept of knights has been formally created. Um, so they're, kind of proto knights. So the closest I could get to replicating the Knights of the Round Table in concept is that they are a military unit that functions similarly to the knightly orders that popped up in the Crusades. So an elite military unit uh, where Arthur is recruiting from young nobles throughout free Western Britain, those kingdoms that have not yet fallen under control of the Saxons, which by this point in history, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Germanic people basically had a huge amount of control over the eastern half of England, especially the southeastern section of England. So, within my story, and this is all speculative.
Pardon me, Mr. Kyle. Could you not move your iPad around so much? We can hear every move you make.
Oh, sorry. Um, so within my story, um, Parador joins Arthur's unit, which I call the Red Dragons, which is a nod to the Draco standard that the late Romans used for their battle standards, and it's a nod to the Welsh flag, which is a red dragon, which is also it's possible at the very least that the Welsh flag is also a nod to that Draco standard that the Romans carried into Britain. Um, so Parador joins the Red Dragons, Arthur's elite cavalry unit. He gets in some training, and then Arthur gets a call from King Leodon in Gododin, which is southern Scotland. Leodon is also basically just a more historically correct name for King Lot, who's famously in Arthurian myth by the 1100s when Geoffrey of Monmouth starts writing about Arthur. And he goes into Scotland and has to fight against a Pict invasion.
Hmm. And that's set in the sort of way where Peridor is telling the story to his kids during winter, right?
Yes, I I I like the idea since the Arthurian myth itself originally comes from the idea of passing down legends by word of mouth, bards and stuff like that. So I thought it'd be a really fun idea to start the story off with old Peridor telling the story of his adventures to his grandkids years later.
Hmm. Very good.
So, Mr. Kyle. Oh, I'm sorry, Ben.
Keep going.
If you had something
No,
you
no,
wanted
go
to
for
ask,
it,
go ahead.
Anthony.
Jason. Okay. I don't want to assume this things in advance. So, Ben did mention that you were coming on. I wasn't familiar, but Ben, I am a big fan of Arthuriana. I'm not going to say I'm anything close to like an expert on it or even close to it. Uh, I'm not even in the realm of like to talk about that, but I've written some of my own Arthuriana and things like that.
Okay.
So the Pict invasion I've seen handled, if I'm remembering this right, which I might not be, in one other place in the various Arthuriana, and that is Stephen Lawhead's book Pendragon, I believe, is about the Pict invasion, unless I'm confusing it with another invasion that he was writing about. Are you familiar with Lawhead?
I feel like the name Pendragon. I might, if I saw the book. I have not read that book. I think I've seen it on Amazon. I have not.
So he has a series called the Pendragon Cycle, which is like his take on the Arthurian legends. He kind of Christianizes them.
Okay.
He actually sets them, I think, again, I'm going off of memory a bit here, but I think around the same period of time as you. However, you seem to be describing a very different, like, I'm not trying to compare it like, oh, you're doing the same thing as Lawhead. You actually don't seem to be at all. I just find it interesting because you're both tackling the different time periods in very different ways, because Lawhead seemed to be trying to Christianize the legends, but also root it in that time while Christianizing them, while you're trying to root them in a sort of history. Like, I think Bernard Cromwell has the Winter King. You're familiar with that?
I am familiar with that. I have not read the book.
Neither have I just know it.
But I've read enough summaries about it that I'm not interested in reading the book, because Bernard does, even despite his great historical fiction novels with The Last Kingdom, he has some Napoleonic warfare stuff.
Oh, that was him, huh?
Yep.
Interesting.
He has some great historical fiction. But then when he turns around, and a couple of other authors have done the same thing. They have great, realistic historical fiction stories, and then they decide to tackle Arthur, and boom, there's dragons and magic and mysticism. It's like, why? Give me a grounded story about a Romano-British warlord that I can believe actually took place in our real world.
Excellent. I like it. Okay. Because the Arthurian legend, as it were, like, I'm enough of a fan of this stuff to like follow the roots of it. It roots,
Hmm.
of course, and I'm sure you are as well. So I'm not trying to patronize you, but roots in the Mabinogion. But then you start to see like there is maybe some historical figure called Arthur who pops up, who is connected with warlords at the Battle of Baden. Uh,
Yep.
so I'm assuming you're kind of rooting it in that sort of idea of Arthur as a warlord from Baden who then gets connected to the Mabinogian Arthur, probably from, cultural
Yeah.
osmosis.
So he's not from Baden. He's Arthur's connected to Baden because Baden is the most famous
Right. Yeah.
battle,
Yes.
and I'm going to be absolutely covering that battle.
Good. Excellent. Yeah. So that's good that you say that too, because that confirms my memory that Lawhead is covering the same time period because he also covers that battle. Uh, incidentally, I do recommend Lawhead series. He actually just came out with a new book very, very recently. Uh, but the Pendragon cycle, and I think it's going
Is
to
that
be a
the one? Is
show.
that the one? Is that the one that Daily Wires is?
Yep, that's the
It's
one.
okay. Okay, I have looked into that one. I'm not interested in it because the Pendragon cycle. It's based on. So it looks like from what I've read, because I already looked into it a while back, and they're doing the exact same thing where they're using a lot. It's using a lot. It's using magic and mysticism. It maybe they're going to go with a different source for the magic. So maybe it's going to be Merlin prays and stuff happens.
Well, I would say yes and no, having read it, but I get your point. You're right that it's not entirely secular, right? Is what I would say. Uh, having read the series, I wouldn't. It is only very, very loosely a fantasy series.
Okay.
Most of the battles are battles. With that said, it's not
Okay.
entirely absent either. So I get what you mean.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to. So I read, well, listened to, because I listened to a lot of books on audio, on Audible. Um, I listened to a great writer, and he's a fellow resident from Idaho, my home state, named James Mace of Legionary Books. He's got this huge, cool book series, the Arthurian Dynasty, because and he's gonna and his plan is to end his, like, at this point he's got 20 books or so in his saga, and it's set from like 980, and it's going all the way into the early 200s, I believe, and it's about the Arturian family. It's going to end with the famous Roman character of Lucius Cassius Artorius, who I'm assuming you guys both probably know. Some historians think Lucius Cassius Artorius may have a link to Arthur. I don't
Hmm.
personally believe that. I think he's too early. That said, the name Arthur may be a derivative of the name Artorius. Um,
Yeah, I've read some pretty interesting books on her. I'm You're probably familiar. Have you heard of Jeffrey Ash?
yeah, I have the
Yeah.
historian.
Yes. So
Yeah,
he wrote
I,
a nonfiction book that I've read, and it's a very interesting book where he tries to identify him with a king named Riothemus. I've also seen theories that Arthur should be identified with an Irish Bible balk at the idea that Arthur could dare be Irish. And this is
no,
right and just. Pride, national pride should preclude such a should cause, I should say, such a reaction. However, I did find the argument to be fairly interesting.
yeah. The problem, so I can find, that's the interesting thing about researching Arthur is I could historical takes on Arthur, and each one will make a convincing argument that, oh, he's really Irish. There's another one that thinks he's Northern Scottish, which I actually think that there's more basis for the
Yeah,
idea.
that's Lawhead's position.
At least the idea for a Scottish warlord makes a little bit more sense, because when I map out all the probable locations for the 12 famous battles that the Welsh writer Nennius attributes to Arthur, about half of them are in northern England or outright in Scotland. And that's why my story Beyond the Wall has him, he's fighting out on that 12 battle list. This book is taking place, it's covering the events of battles 6 and 7, I think it is, without having the list in front of me. The battles of Celadon Coit, which most historians believe, oh, that's the woods of Scotland. Cool. And then the next battle is Gwinian Fort, which nobody has any idea where that is. But I thought it was funny. So I'm a soldier, and I like simple answers. I firmly believe that, generally speaking, the most obvious answer to a question is probably the most likely to be correct. So I've read all these theories about Gwinian Fort, which most people believe means something along the lines of the White Fort, because Gwyn, the prefix Gwyn means white. Nobody has any idea what to make of the suffix, the Ian part, but everybody's trying to make guesses whenever you read online on where these 12 battles were. Everybody's trying to make guesses on some white-walled fort, or maybe white was symbolic for some pure place. It's like, well, okay. I know Gwyn is used in names, i.e., the most famous name, Guinevere. So it's like, hey, here's an idea that nobody seems to be throwing out there. Maybe Gwinian was a name. In which case, I can make this battle any dang where I want. If Gwinian Fort was essentially the fort of a guy named Gwinian. And that's what I went with.
Yeah, that's that's a very plausible idea. It's one of those things, like, I've made this point in the past, for example, when so we know this is like a bit of a tangent from Arthur, but it's related, I promise. We know, if people who look into the historic Iliad, right? And we know that there was, in fact, some sort of war at the ruins of an area that's generally identified with Troy, right?
Yeah.
Yes. This is a fact. It's not debated. Like, it's just what was the nature of the war that we don't really know. So
there's so many wars that were fought around the Mediterranean. It's like, how could you not believe there was a Trojan War? Of course it was a Trojan War. That pretty much every bit of shore along that whole Mediterranean Sea had a battle on it at some point.
Right. So one of my questions is, I remember I've talked about this with people, and I go, so why did the war start? We would go and we would say something like, obviously it wasn't because Helen, a Greek princess was kidnapped by a Trojan, right? And then I pause and I go, why? Why is that implausible? Like, why here? And then I go, here's a question: why did World War I start? And then go, well, an Austrian archduke was assassinated by Serbian terrorists. Okay, is that any less, like, why is that more plausible to you than a princess was kidnapped? Yeah. Right, like, I don't get why we're saying one of these things is totally plausible, absolutely happened. One of them is clearly a myth and can't have happened. Like, I think it's very possible that the legend of the Iliad started because a Greek princess was kidnapped from Sparta. Like, why not?
It's not even like that. Even then, like, when people say that, when detractors like attack it on that, it's like, it's also like not fully accurate. It was, the most powerful king of the region's wife. She was seduced away. She was kidnapped. It's like, yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't the most powerful king of the region not want to get back, his wife and stuff like that? And it's like, you still talk to him about it, and for some reason it's like, no, I don't get it.
Ultimate act of disrespect. That, what was that prince's name?
Paris.
Menelaus?
Paris. It's like, that's the most disrespectful thing you could possibly do. Go to some other king's house, and while you're partying at his house, you seduce and then take away his wife very publicly. It's like, oh, were you trying to start a war? That's I'd say that's justified.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think of Arthur, and it's kind of the same thing. Like, so many things, like, oh, he couldn't have been betrayed to like why not? Jeffrey Ash points out that that Rio Thamus was defeated in a town called Avalon or Avignon,
Yep.
probably would be the
Yep.
pronoun, in France, and a man named Medraut who like betrayed him and then took refuge in Rome or something like that.
So,
So
connecting Midraut to Riothemus or Rio, I've seen the name. I know the name. I'm actually using that name in my
mhm.
Arthurian saga. Yeah, spoiler. For anybody who watches this, I'm actually making Uther the nickname of Riothemus.
So you're using the Riothemus theory. I like it.
To a degree. So I'm not gonna make Riothemus Arthur, but because I can't find the name Uther anywhere except a very sketchy genealogy of one of the British kingdoms where it lists Arthur, son of Uther, I like the idea that Riothemus could have been Uther. Because Uther means something along the lines of great and terrible, which is just as likely to be a nickname. Of course, that's the problem with a lot of names. There's people saying Riothemus was probably a title. I don't believe that for a second for a couple reasons. There's same problem comes up with the name Vortigern, even though like 5 or 6 different sources reference Vortigern. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions him. Bede, Gildas, all these different sources reference Vortigern, and yet there's people that still on the fence on whether he exists. It's like, oh, I'm sure he existed. But then the next question that comes up is, well, Vortigern also means something along the lines of High King. So was it a name or was it a title? There again, the soldier in me is just, okay, you know what? Everybody's just calling him Vortigern or King Vortigern. Sounds like Vortigern's a name. Cool. Running with that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I am borrowing where I can. I use the early historical sources. I look at so nothing in my book nothing in the book that I've written and nothing in the roughly 10 or so books that I have planned is going to contradict Nennius. But the problem, and that's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Nennius, those are the two biggest, most fleshed out and earliest sources that I have available on the Arthurian saga, basically. So nothing in my book is contradicting them, but there's also so many gaps. I can't rely on just them. So, like, with the case of Arthur, if I had gone just with Nennius, if I discounted Geoffrey of Monmouth, which a lot of historians seem to despise that guy, well, then I don't know who his parents are. I don't know literally anything about him other than the fact that the kings of Britain nominated him as the Dux Bellorum or Duke of Battles on 12 different occasions, and that he beat some enemy, 12 different times. That's all Nennius gives us on Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, I'm willing to pull from Geoffrey of Monmouth, who has a much more fleshed out story of Arthur, and then I just take the realistic elements from that. So there again, almost nothing in my books contradicts Geoffrey of Monmouth. I just also left stuff out. So my character is not named Merlin. It's Myrthin. Funny story.
Yeah, that's one of the traditional ways of people kind of
Well, that's what the
use.
name. Yeah, that name actually it is a known Welsh name, so it just makes sense that anybody
Mm-hmm.
trying to present a historical Arthurian story would go with that, or you could do with a lady from the 1950s. Their name's escaping me. I actually just listened to her first book on Merlin's Cave, but she goes with a
Oh, Mary Stuart.
Yes, her. And she uses the name Merlinus, which I mean Geoffrey of Monmouth also does. So it's like, okay, that tracks as well. But I just stuck with Myrthin. Which funny story I read about the only reason from what I've read that Geoffrey of Monmouth changed the name. He was very much aware of the name Myrthin, but he changed it to Merlin for his writings, because you got to think at the time that Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a Welsh writer but who also spoke a few different languages, This is only 100 years after the Normans took over England that Geoffrey Monmouth writes his History of the Kings of Britain. He changed the name Myrddin to Merlin because Myrddin, as it's spelled, it looks like it should say Myrddin because there's a double D, which turns out for the Welsh language, the double D makes a th sound. So like it's not Gododin, it's Godothin. Um, so Myrddin in spelling looks too close to the French word merda, if you know what that means.
Yes.
So because of that similarity, Geoffrey of Monmouth changed it to Merlin. That's what I
Interesting.
that's what I've read. I don't know for fact that it's true, but that's what I have read. It makes sense.
Yeah, it does make some sense. I like if you read. I'm thinking over some of the stuff that I read. Like, so one of my problems with I guess problems is kind of wrong. It's not really a problem. It's just a fact of
Mhm.
the Arthurian corpus, right? Is that finding a historical Arthur seems to really be a lesson in I don't want to say futility, but it turns to the question of what do you mean by the historical Arthur? Do you mean the guy in the Mabinogion? Because in that case, you're probably not going to find him. On the other hand, the names Bedivere or Bedweir and Kay
Uh-huh.
go and with very consistent personalities even go all the way back to the
Yep.
Mabinogion, like which is fascinating to me. Uh, but even then, it's like, are you going to find that guy? Well, no. Are you going to find a warlord? Maybe. Are you going to find a king who then got associated with Arthur? Probably multiple that ended up getting used in like the Monmouth's history of Britain. So it's like, was there a historical Arthur? Probably not. Were
Uh,
there people who they combined or looked at and said, like, we're going to incorporate these elements into the Arthurian legend? Probably, right? That's my theory. That's
so
my
there,
thoughts, I should say, not necessarily theory. It's
so
how
there
I tend to think of it.
So there are, if you look through the genealogies of the various Welsh kingdoms, the name Arthur does show up. There's a few King Arthurs in Welsh genealogies. Now, of course, genealogies are one of the first things that used for propaganda purposes, so you can't treat them as gospel. Um, so I think there are a few Arthurs. By the way, there's also a historical Owain, son of Urien of the kingdom of Reged. I wanted to use that Owain in my story, but unfortunately, the very real historical Owain is a century too late for my story. So I used the name and I made him from another kingdom instead. In my first draft, I was using Owain, son of Urien, and then I finally decided I was like, man, I'm fairly certain the historical Owain is an entire century off, and I'm not comfortable with playing with that kind of wiggle room, using that kind of wiggle room.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make my story as I'm trying to make it to the point that very, very few historians will be able to look through my story and say, that's wrong, that's wrong. I'm trying to eliminate that as much as possible.
Very nice. I like. It's an interesting approach. At least I appreciate somebody trying it out because
Yeah.
it's rare in Arthurian fiction. Like I know T.H. White has said just outright that he didn't really care about the historicity, and I love the Once and Future King. I think it's excellent, but yeah, he's like not even trying with the history aspect of it, right?
Oh, yeah, I totally am. See, that's to go back to a point that I made a little while ago. James Mace, Legionary Books, his Arturian Saga. My intent, and I've had conversations with him about my intent as well, is that you could, if you're a fan of Roman history, and what was that internet meme? Turns out most guys think about Rome at least a little bit. Um, so if you're a fan of like Roman history, If you were to go through, for example, and read James Mace, our Arthurian dynasties going all the way from like 9 AD, right after the Teutoburg Forest, however you pronounce that, that massacre, all the way up to, I believe Mace is going to end his saga with Lucius Cassus Artorius in, I think, the 200s. You could go from his books to picking up my novels. There's going to be a little bit of a time gap, but you could go from his books to mine and feel like you're still reading about the same world. That's my intent. Or you could start with my books, go from there, and pick up, I don't know, Bernard, Cromwell, Cornwall. I think it's Cornwall. His Last Kingdom books set in the Viking Age, which are, I think, pretty grounded. I'm definitely no expert on the Viking Age, but listening to his book, it felt grounded in history. So you could go from my book to any other historical fiction book in roughly the same period and feel like you're still reading actual historical fiction and not a fantasy story. Or just like, the 2004 Clive Owen movie, it's a great story, but the history that they tell is really chopped up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't look to like Hollywood for historical accuracy,
Yeah.
with the one exception of 1970s Waterloo. Uh, Probably the single most historically accurate Hollywood movie ever made. And I say this because I only recently saw that movie and was duly impressed with it.
Well, technically, Barry Lyndon was similar because it used pretty much the same clothes everyone was wearing at the time.
Barry Lyndon.
It's
I'm looking this up.
it's a Kubrick one.
Oh yeah.
And,
Now I remember it.
they actually used the clothing literally from museums that they had been wearing at the time.
Wow.
And just to bring it all full circle, he had originally intended to direct a biopic on Napoleon, but lost his financing because of the commercial failure of Waterloo. Incredible.
That's a shame.
Yeah, that is a shame.
Mm.
But yeah, in the Arthuriana that I've written two major pieces of Arthuriana. One of them was a book. It was an anthology of stories that's unfortunately off the market now because the publishing house shuttered, and with 20 different authors, it is a pain to get all of everything like regathered and sent out again. Though I'd love to do it one day. This was called Tales of the Once and Future King, and it was like about the return of Arthur.
Okay.
And stories that were about King Arthur with a frame story about like people in a post-apocalyptic future and Arthur during Arthur's return. And another story that I published within the last year was called The Last Fight of Sir Lancelot, and it was a riff on the old legend that Sir Lancelot, after everything went down, he retired to a hermitage.
Yeah.
So incidentally, I like totally ignored I just took that very basic core idea and then went entirely in my own direction, because actually the concept is that he started a hermitage with like fellow knights and just kind of lived the rest of his life there, and I had it that he like fled to a monastery on the outskirts of France in a tiny town and just lived there for the last 7 decades of his life.
Okay.
Right. But in the way that I approach King Arthur and those sorts of things is I tend to take a very flexible. It's kind of funny because you're describing like almost the opposite of like the way that I view it and how I do it. Not that I think that your approach is great too. Like I have absolutely nothing against it. I think that people should do it, and I have already pre-ordered your book.
Cool.
But so I have no issue with the way you're doing it. But the way that I do it is very much like if somebody mentioned it and it was connected to Arthur, it is now fair game. So it's like I have people who are like, yeah, they're connected to. They meet like Charlemagne, Is that like 1,000 years too late? Shut up. Nobody asked you.
I mean,
Uh,
if you're going with the Thomas Mallory,
mm,
those Arthur, well then yeah, you can put him anywhere in the Middle Ages. The only reason, so I connect him to the 500s because one key event that almost every writer mentions, I can't remember if Gildas writing in the 500s did or not, but I'm fairly certain that Bede mentioned them. Nennius definitely did. Then Geoffrey of Monmouth did, and that's talk about the arrival of the Saxon warlords Hengist and Horsa, which even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and a couple of other sources consistently date to have occurring between 447 to 449. I split the difference and set the date at 448. A lot of these writers, to include Geoffrey, infuriatingly doesn't like putting dates to events. But since they all mention the same event, it's like, cool, give me one event in your whole timeline. Let's take the arrival of Hengist and Horsa, and now I can put together a timeline of roughly when everything else happened. So when I do that, it looks like it's like, well, a couple different sources mention the Battle of Camlin when Arthur dies, for example. It's like, okay, if he's fighting in battle, he's probably not much older than his early 50s. So that means Camlin. So if going from the arrival of Hengist and Horsa, 447, okay, who's on scene that's connected to Arthur? Well, if you go off of Geoffrey of Monmouth, there's King Vortigern. He starts a 20-year war. Well, his son does with Hengist and Horsa. So now you're down into the 460s, 470s. That's right around the time that a young Ambrosius Aurelianus and Uther show up in Britain to depose Vortigern and continue the fight against the Saxons. So, and then shortly thereafter, Uther gives birth to Arthur, so that means Arthur's born probably tentatively 480s. So it's like, okay, the Battle of Badon Hill is supposed to have occurred sometime in anywhere between 500 to about 515. And then forward that to, so it's like, so everything, so when you look at the key of when the key events of everything happening, it's like their timelines line up pretty interestingly well. So yeah, I have Arthur being born in, I think, the mid 480s. That puts him, he'll take command of my admittedly fictional, very late Roman, post-Roman unit, the Red Dragons, in the early, like just before 500. He'll fight a few of his battles against some Anglos and Saxons, and then he'll go back home, which I've placed his stronghold. It's not his home, but his fort where he's posted. I've set it at Caerleon, in eastern Wales. So from there, I then have him go north to fight some Picts. You mentioned, Anthony, you mentioned a Pict invasion. So it probably wouldn't be the same one that might be mentioned in the Pendragon cycle, because basically, as the Romans were pulling out in the early 400s, the Picts, who were the inhabitants of Scotland at that time, they started invading south frequently. There was no single invasion. It was just constant incursions and raids. So the Picts started invading in the south. The Irish Gaels started invading in from Ireland. And in fact, they created a territory in Wales. They captured the island of Anglesey. They also started a kingdom in Scotland called Dalriada. And that was the Gaels who did that specifically was the Scotti tribe. The Scotti eventually take over Caledonia, i.e. Scotland, and that's where that name came from. And of course, so you got this Picts coming in from the south, the Irish coming in from the west, and then you got Saxons, Angles, and Jutes invading the entire eastern side of England. So it was absolute madness during that time period. The population of England cratered. It went from, I'm bad at remembering numbers, but I'm wanting to say at the height of Roman rule in Britain, the population there was a couple of million. When Rome pulled out, between their withdrawal and all the invasions from the north, the east, the west, the population cratered to, I'm wanting to say, about a million. And the population of Great Britain did not go back to what it was at the height of Roman rule until the late Middle Ages.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is, you hear about depopulation.
Oh yeah. There was whole, like, London was almost a ghost town because London was a Roman town. London was basically the heart of Roman power. So you got to think. So in the late 300s, the Roman Empire they're fighting Attila the Hun in France and in the area north of Italy. They're fighting the Visigoths, the Goths. They're fighting tons of civil wars. Like every couple of years, there's a new civil war. So the value of their currency plummets. Their military power. They slowly keep plucking legions out of Britain to go fight other places. Like there's the famous story of the missing Ninth Legion out of Britain. Yeah, historians found them. They didn't disappear anywhere. They just got stationed in the eastern front of the Roman Empire to deal with threats from there. At least there's strong evidence for that. It's not a concrete thing. But yeah, so the Roman economy collapsed. Throughout the late 300s, they kept pulling troops out of Britain. And as they're doing that, of course, the coinage goes to crap. And think about what happens now. Cities are not self-sustaining, right? So, and that was true of major cities in the ancient world. Rome couldn't sustain itself. They desperately needed the breadbasket of Egypt. So when they lost Egypt, that was almost the death knell for the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire. And it was the same with London in England. When Rome stopped having the ability to send coins, send food to the population in London, the population there cratered. And it was just a domino effect of all of Roman Britain. People are getting killed. I think a lot of the people just straight up abandoned England once the last of the legions left as well. And yeah, there were whole cities from what I've read. I mean, read Gildas's account. A lot of historians don't put a lot of stock into him anymore, but it's like, okay, the guy was still writing in that same time period. I feel like it's very arrogant for me 1,600 years ago, away from Gildas, a guy living through this. I feel like it's kind of arrogant for me to say, oh yeah, Gildas didn't know what he was talking about. That really? The guy can look out a window and see what's going on.
There were whole towns he used to go to that disappeared. Like,
yes. Him and then Gildas and then Bede writing 100 years later, basically saying the same thing.
Yep. And there seems to be kind of a cycle with that stuff, at least in the medieval times. And he had the Stefan and Matilda fight. You had, Norman invasion. You had, pick your poison. There's something there that, something there for more Britons to die over, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. The Anglo-Saxons didn't actually hold England for very long in the grand scheme of things. It's like they really started invading England hard after the Romans left. And then with the collapse, the Romans left England in 410. Saxons started pouring in. The Western Empire collapsed in 476. That was when a Gothic or Visigothic warlord took over and sent the crown and the royal robes and stuff like that of the emperor back to the Eastern Empire and said, Rome doesn't need an emperor anymore. It's like I mark that as it's like, okay, that is the end of the Western Roman Empire in my book. There's a few people that would debate that, but it's like, okay, come on, so in that
That
period,
was the
like 410.
yeah.
Huh?
It's important to like a lot of people over intellectualize it. Well, Rome was still standing. Rome was still an important port. Yeah, okay, fine. But there wasn't any meaningful Roman power there. Just because the Visigothic king is like, okay, what's the easiest way to rule? Yeah, if you put on this toga for 5 minutes during a holiday, you can rule much easier. They won't care. Okay, so he puts on the toga. That doesn't mean it's Roman rule. That doesn't mean it's Roman Empire. When Julius Nepos failed, that was it. There was nobody else. No historian goes, yeah, Romulus Augustulus could have done it. No, nobody says that. Julius Nepos was the last one who had any sort of chance. He lost in 476, and then he died in 480, if I recall correctly. So, take your pick. It's a similar thing with other historical events. It's like, yeah, sure, fine. Technically, XYZ did or didn't happen, or, people weren't literate and stuff like that. In reality, though, these are the sources we got. And you can kind of tell what the bad sources are. When Procopius wrote his secret history, frankly, it's obvious that clearly is either a piece of hatred for his master, or something that he could go, oh, actually, guys, you overthrew my master. I was on your side the entire time, and I've got this book to prove it. Like it's this weird thing where, like, if someone brings up, say, like, the historicity of a saint or Jesus or something, they'll suddenly become the most, oh, well, it wasn't really like that, blah 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 blah, well,
Funny
what.
enough, there's probably more evidence to prove that the person of Jesus existed than there is Arthur. There's actually quite a bit of historical evidence to suggest that Jesus existed.
There's actually more than, like, quite a few. There's more about Jesus within, like, 100 years of his life than most Roman emperors.
There are 4 full biographies written within, like, what, 50 years of his death. That's insane. That's actually insane.
Yeah.
Yes.
The YouTuber Metatron does a really good job of outlining the historical evidence. Like, he cites sources and everything really well, showing the evidence for Jesus. I'd love him to do the same thing for Arthur. It's like, help me out here, man. Let's see, like, the only grounded source that we have that has any real justification for being a historical source is Nennius, and we're not even sure. It's like, okay, we have we think it's a ninth century document. We think written by Nennius. So I don't blame historians for completely dismissing Arthur, but at the same time, it's like, it's such a believable story. And then when you consider that the name Arthur starts showing up a lot in genealogies in the late 500s to 600s, it's like, man, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to believe that some prominent Romano-Briton named Arthur could have indeed existed.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like I said, what I was talking about, I wasn't, like, dismissing the idea of a historical Arthur. Rather, what I was saying is what we view as, like, the historical Arthur, what we think of as a biography of Arthur, is probably not entirely one person, right?
Right.
Like
I
the
would agree.
now that's not to say there is nobody who can be the original basis of the myth. There can't have been like a first point, but once again, I go back to like, well, the earliest Arthur we get, and this early Arthur like has more elements than you think. Like it has
Yeah.
Kay and it has Bedivere,
Yep.
right? Is
Right.
the Mabinogion, and the
Yep.
Mabinogion is clearly not historical.
That's
Uh,
that's the composition that includes the poem, the Pagur, right?
I believe so. It was put together in the 1800s by
Yeah.
a Welsh noblewoman.
Okay.
yes, it's a fascinating book, by the way. I recommend taking a
Yep.
look at it anyway, just because of the myths and legends in it are very, very interesting. So
Okay.
I have
Cool.
a question for you. I'm curious about this.
Yeah.
In your book,
Uh huh.
now you mentioned that you're trying as much to ground this to the extent that you can.
Yes.
Are you planning on doing anything with the Holy Grail? Because to me, that's something that is so tied up in the Arthurian myths that almost everyone I've seen tries to do something with it at some point.
That is going to be a major plot point of book two. Because
Nice.
so for me, the Holy Grail is an easy thing to add in because look at the Middle Ages, how obsessed the church was with relics. All the way, and that goes all the way back to Emperor Constantine, whose wife supposedly found the true cross.
Mm-hmm.
The church started collecting relics right from the get-go. So the idea that, and this is the basic premise that I'm trying to, I don't want to give away too much, but essentially,
Yeah.
the Holy Grail is going to be a relic, and I'm not going to, I will of course confirm, yes, the Grail. What I will emphasize is that King Laodon in the northern kingdom of Gododin has in his possession what is believed to be the Holy Grail, that is believed to have, the power of God for anybody who uses it. That, I will stress that it's believed to be. It may be, it may not be. It's definitely not going to be like something out of Indiana Jones.
Right.
Sure.
But including the Holy Grail, oh yeah, that's too easy to do. I'm even going to introduce, after a fashion, I'm bringing in the Fisher King.
Excellent.
That is an
Uh,
important theme of
actually
King
writing,
Arthur.
I'm actually getting ready to write a short story right now for Canon Publishing for an anthology that they're putting out later this spring. And it's going to be, so do you guys know of the character Garuluid?
No.
Anthony, you probably should.
Can you repeat that name?
Garuluid.
Is that the guy who turned into a werewolf?
Bingo! Yes,
Yes.
exactly. The leader of the dog heads.
Aha. Okay.
Cynocephali.
Well, to me that's just as easy to rationalize as the Holy Grail. The first time I read that poem, the first thing that I thought of was the Roman signifiers who wore lion or wolf skins.
And somebody's copying their style.
Yeah, I mean, even up to the Viking age, warriors, especially of barbarian-like tribes, so, frequently wore animal skins. So, especially, can you envision a group of warriors coming out of the mist, like just as dawn is setting, or just as the sun is coming up, and they're all wearing wolf skins, so that it's shadowy and everything, and maybe they're howling and stuff like that.
Oh,
Especially
yeah.
already a superstitious people, you could easily think, "Oh my God, it's the dog heads."
Oh, yeah. Especially when, like, only two guys survive.
So
Both of them with, like,
yeah,
head blows and stuff like that. It's like,
so
yeah, absolutely.
the character of Garuluid is already in book one.
Hmm.
Because I wanted to bring him in there because in the Pagur, I thought it was really interesting that I believe it's Bedwyr who fights Garuluid in a one-on-one duel, and as they're fighting his dog heads, he's actually crying about it. The poem actually, which is really interesting. Um, to me, the only reason a warrior would be crying while fighting an enemy is that he either knows that enemy or he just otherwise has great respect for that enemy.
Mm.
So if we're going on the assumption that, okay, these dog heads, I can use the story of the dog heads. That's a very easy one, to put into the real world. So right in my story Beyond the Wall, the character of Garuluid, he's being described as a very fierce warrior. He's one of the levied chieftains that King Laodon musters to fight alongside of Arthur against the Picts. Which means Garuluid has had a chance to fight alongside of Arthur's men. But for reasons that I'm going to disclose in my short story leading up to book 2, he'll be the main enemy in book 2.
Yeah.
I'm going to have so much. I already have it all planned out. Garuluid is going to be such a fun character. I actually just made a post about him either this morning or yesterday on my Facebook page.
Nice.
Yeah.
I always like those fun characters because you can do a lot with them. Because there's, because we don't really care for the word realism here due to how it's often taken as a sort of shibboleth for um, unfun things.
Well,
But that sort of thing has always been fine with me, like certain dogmen and stuff like that,
yeah.
because this was a real practice. I don't think many people knew as much what they could do about it as much as people today think. Like many of these people, many historians only know a modern war. Or wars that where they were in the general staff or something, you know, it's I don't, like dude, you spend all your time in an ivory tower. I don't trust your opinion about how realistic or unrealistic this stuff is. Quite frankly, if my enemy, pisses himself and runs in panic, I don't have to fight that guy. And he's going to spread
Yeah.
that panic to everyone who sees him unless there's a master, around to drag him back into line. So it's like it is actually an incredibly intelligent strategy to staple a dog's head to yourself and charge in berserker style if
Oh
they're
yeah.
not ready for you.
Absolutely. Psychological warfare. That's always been a thing.
Oh yeah, especially if you just juiced his best friend next to him, like he's done, he's out, he's running.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so one of my test readers, she's been tearing through it over the last couple days. She has a Master of Arts in Arthurian literature specifically, and she's equestrian who one of her hobbies is freaking jousting.
Nice.
She is about, as of this morning, over halfway through my book, and she's freaking loving Beyond the Wall. So I feel like when a Master of Arts, with somebody with her pedigree, Master of Arts in Arthurian literature specifically, the hobbies that she's got, when she's loving the book,
Oh
probably,
yeah.
I probably did something right.
Especially since in the pre-show conversation, you said you were a part of the cavalry. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm still in the army. I retire in another 5 months, and for the last several years, I'm in the cavalry. Yeah, so I've got my gold spurs. I've deployed. I haven't done a whole lot of cavalry stuff on my specific deployments. That would imply that I've done combat in a Bradley. I haven't. So I was in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a combat engineer. Got shot at, got mortared, stuff like that. My second tour was between 2007 and 2009. By that time, I was a cavalry scout, but I was in a military transition team, so I was on a security detail for a bunch of officers, and we would roam around our area, around Baghdad, going to Iraqi army installations, doing inspections, checking up on their training and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And on that one, we had to deal with a lot of IED strikes and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't implying that you've personally, gotten onto a horse and charged into the enemy during the global war on terror.
Yeah,
Certainly,
there
I
is an
think.
S- there is a special forces team that did that in Afghanistan.
Oh yeah, it's like I
There's a
like it.
movie on it, even 12 Strong.
Oh wow, I might have to
It's a
check that
great
out.
movie with Chris Hemsworth, who, by the way, Chris Hemsworth was who I had in mind when I described Arthur's looks.
Very good. But you said you really want to delve into the cavalry work and the horses and the
Yeah.
battles in there. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Oh yeah. So I mean, so warfare, especially back in the day, was very much a rock paper scissors. Archers, infantry were you had so if you go back, why did the Romans make their have their large shields with their small swords and and the formation that they fought in? It was largely to counter the barbarian tribes and the Greek phalanxes, which were like really unwieldy, slow formations.
Hmm.
And then, but then the Romans had a problem with especially the Gallic cavalry because cavalry is really good at maneuvering around infantry. So, and that's another reason why the legend of Arthur makes total sense to me. It's like, well, if we assume that he was a cavalryman, which knights, that's the defining trait of a knight. If we
Hmm.
go into once you go into the medieval period, that's why the U.S. cavalry, more than sabers and anything else, that's why we award spurs, because spurs are one of the ultimate symbols for a knight, because mounted warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I love the idea of cavalry, partially just being a part of that tradition, if only in a very vague way at this point in time. There's obviously quite a bit of a difference between a wedge formation of horses and a wedge formation of Bradley fighting vehicles. But the fundamental job of the cavalry, funny enough, is still the same. Bradleys are used to maneuver around a battlefield ahead of the infantry. Cavalry still kick out, conduct reconnaissance,
Mm-hmm.
attack targets of opportunity, and if and when we get in over our heads, we go link back up with the infantry. And so that's why I used very heavily for my story Beyond the Wall. So Arthur brings his red dragons, and in keeping with the medieval concept that armies in the ancient period were huge. Like the Romans would field whole legions at a time in some battles. But that takes being able to field large battles requires a massive logistical support system.
Yes.
That logistical support system cratered, of course, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. So at least, and I'm not an expert on Byzantine history, so I don't know how big their battles were, but in the West, the Saxons, the Romano-Britons, all those guys, the number of people that they could field in a battle shrunk dramatically. Battles started numbering in the hundreds in some cases. So I kept my Arthurian force pretty small for Beyond the Wall. Arthur only I state in the book that the at full strength the red dragons number roughly 1,000 men, but there's only ever maybe 300 on active duty, so to speak, at any given time. The
Right.
rest are the rest are because they're noblemen. The rest are at home, living their lives, defending their own lands, and if needed, Arthur can call them up. So in my story, Arthur takes his 300 or so riders, goes to Scotland, and then plugs his cavalry in to support the another several hundred infantry that are just a peasant army of levied farmers from the king of Gododin, and that's one of those men is Garuluid, who just happens to also be a pretty fierce dude. And then, so he plugs in with them, and then the fundamental story is Arthur then, because he's heavy cavalry and because he's an aggressive commander, he wastes no time and takes the fight to the Picts. So there's a battle, the Battle of Celadon Coit. Arthur maneuvers around them, fights and destroys one force. A second force of Picts then come in. I just realized I'm probably giving away more of the plot than I should. But either way, he then fights a second battle, the Battle of Gwinian Fort. And there's a couple of skirmishes that happen as well, where I'm pretty happy with the way the Battle of Gwinian Fort came around, though, because Arthur starts the fight by attacking their camp right at the crack of dawn in a classic cavalry attack.
Very classic.
Oh, yeah. Like, I even go so far as to say, I have Arthur, I don't know how historical this is, but it's certainly a tactic I've seen used and I've personally used in training exercises. I'm kind of devious that way. And I have Kay's forces attack with Sun at their back, attack the Picts camp. Arthur holds back another huge group of his force. Wait until the Picts have formed up their battle lines to deal with Kay, and then Arthur comes in and attacks the rear of the Pict formation that's formed up to face against Kay. So even though his forces are vastly outnumbered, just the fact that he's constantly maneuvering around, if they start to get overwhelmed, cool, they pull back 50 yards and throw javelins. If they need to, they can pull back another 50 yards and basically kite the Picts until either their formation breaks from having javelins thrown at them, or they spread out enough that the cavalry can turn around and charge into them. So it's very, very fun showcasing how well a disciplined heavy cavalry force can just absolutely destroy a much bigger, lighter armed, lesser disciplined infantry force.
Oh yeah. Well,
I had fun with that.
there's a lot to have fun with. I mean, there's a lot to do it for, because you can get into the mindset of them. You can have the fun of adventure, of that comes with a battle for, because this is a YA novel, YA-ish novel, right?
It's why I think the best way to describe it is YA friendly. Originally, when I first outlined and started writing a story, Peridor was going to be a 14-year-old kid. He was not going to actually be a soldier. He was going to be maybe like a servant to Arthur. He was going to get isolated from Arthur's command, and the bulk of the story was going to be him trying to survive the wilderness of Scotland and link back up with Arthur. That was with the threat of Picts in the area. That was the original concept, and then it just kind of evolved with some prodding from my publisher, and the meat of the story is actually still there. Peridor got turned from a 14-year-old to a 16-year-old. Instead of being just a servant to Arthur, he's one of Arthur's younger soldiers. I actually bring up a couple points where he's disrespected because of his age, and of course, he's old enough to be really insulted by that. And he does still get isolated from Arthur's command. He does still spend a few days out in the woods. In fact, that gave me the opportunity to bring in another character who's becoming popular with some of my test readers, a female runaway Pict slave, a girl called Gemma. And she links up with Peridor, and in exchange for him helping her, she guides him out of the woods because he gets hopelessly lost. So that core survival story is actually still there. And then he links up with Arthur after, so Peridor is not actually at the Battle of Celadon Coit. He's lost in the woods and injured from a skirmish during that battle, but he links up with Arthur in time to warn him of a second force coming in, and he fights at the Battle of Gwinian Fort. So I have made the story more intense for adults, but there's still no sex, there's no nudity, there's very mild profanity, to the level that I would say if this book were made into a movie exactly as written, it would be in the PG 13 range. So it's definitely, I would say it's definitely YA friendly.
Hmm.
But all my test readers are adults, and like I said, so far I'm getting pretty positive feedback.
Yeah. And yeah, I get you. Uh, but I was about to say, especially when like I said earlier about the historians in the ivory towers and stuff like that. It's like, have you guys
Yeah.
seen a horse? Like you maybe you've been to like a petting zoo where you've seen Maple, the friendly horse that's been ridden on by kids for 45 years or something ridiculous like that. But like a
Yeah.
war horse in Barding, bred,
Yeah.
for it, and you haven't actually seen much of a horse except in passing, unless you're, a farm owner or something like that. Well, a farm horse isn't the same as
A war
a
horse.
war horse at all,
Yeah.
temperament, anything. So it's like, yeah, no, like if you just saw your friend get smushed down, if you're getting smushed down by a 300 strong ultra armored cavalry charge, you have no
Hmm.
pike wall, no spike defenses,
Yeah.
you're just done. Like it's unless you're really disciplined, you're just going to be like, I'm out of here. I can't take this.
And even
Horses are
if they are
scary.
disciplined enough, and I do try to portray the picks so that they don't they're pretty competent for their level of training. They
Mm.
do try to form shield walls. They do try to defend against Arthur. And that's when Arthur just like, oh, you're prepared for a cavalry fight. Cool. We're just going to back off and throw javelins at you while I have a secondary force attack you from the rear.
Yep.
Because I figure it's like, well, that kind of tactic works great today. That kind of tactic works great in pretty much any time period.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Because it's like getting punched in the back of the head. It's like, you just got punched in the back of the head, my dude. You
yeah.
know what
And
can
yeah,
you do?
it blows my mind the kind of stuff that I read historians in their articles online, the kind of stuff that they completely dismiss as completely unrealistic. Like I've read one article, I can't remember which guy was like, "Oh yeah, the idea of Arthur fighting 12 battles and winning all 12." It's like, wow, all that many battles in one lifetime and that good of a win record, that's just too unrealistic. I'm just like, okay. Battles in this period were you could have anywhere from 100 men to 1,000 men. So the idea, and considering that this is occurring in a time period where there are no less than three different factions invading a relatively an island small enough that you could travel by horseback from one end to the other in a month.
Hmm.
So the idea that one proactive, smart commander, especially a cavalry commander, could fight 12 different battles and win against these types of barbarian enemies, especially if he's trained in the Roman style of combat and everything. If he's been,
Oh yeah.
so that the idea that one well-trained Romano Briton could fight various untrained, undisciplined Saxons, Picts, Irish raiders, only on one relatively small island. That seems like what's unrealistic about that? And then I also noticed, being a soldier, I noticed that of those 12 battles, something like 9 of them occur along rivers.
Yep.
So okay, well, let's look at the Battle of Stirling Bridge that the Scottish fought against a much bigger, much better equipped English army. So like, okay, yeah, that makes it seem even more plausible.
Right. It's like, like what are people supposed to expect? Well, he didn't win 12 battles. It's like Julius Caesar won like every battle in his life.
Yes,
Like
right?
like if he's like the equivalent of like an English Julius Caesar here,
Yes,
like it's perfectly reasonable. How many battles
yeah,
did Napoleon win? Well, he only had to lose two of them. Well, sure, but like his armies were like I won't say invincible, but it's like his armies were always like the end boss of a video game every time they had to actually fight,
Yeah.
rather than have a little skirmish. Like there's an unrealistic perspective of it. What I was saying earlier is that yeah, they seem to like, oh, Jesus Christ, all these battles, and they take this jeweler's loop to it, to check the diamonds, number. Is this a real diamond? It's like, no, well, but then like you bring up something that tears the idea apart, and they suddenly become guileless as babies. It's like, no, you guys have a double standard. You just don't like heroes.
Yes.
Like or men of heroic will and stuff like that. Like, look
Yes.
at guys like George Washington. Like
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, absolutely, but like,
Look at
sure,
any of the men that were in Washington's army at Valley Forge. I actually took a trip to Valley Forge like 2 years ago.
yes,
I made a point of going there in December so I could see that place. So it's like, you look at any of the. I would be terrified to fight Washington's the army that came out of Valley Forge.
yes,
I would have been terrified to fight against. Like, these guys starved. They went through rigorous training without proper clothing, dealing with frostbite.
mm,
They're going through all these kind of hardships before even going into battle. It's like they want to kill you so bad that they're willing to be starved, go through a freezing cold winter without even shoes, losing toes and such, in order to train to be able to kill you better.
mm.
It's like, you get an army like that. So like, imagine. So I think Arthur's army would have been. That's the kind of men, the men at Valley Forge, the guys who trained to invade the guys in the 101st, Band of Brothers who trained to go to Normandy and stuff like that. It's like that level of commitment and resolve. That is a terrifying army.
Oh yeah. And and that's what really wins the wars there. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like you can have your berserker rages and stuff like that, but fundamentally, what's defeated the Vikings, ignoring the fact that Normans were descended from Vikings, and we're ignoring that for a second, was the Anglo-Saxon courage, to not give up and stuff like that, because
Well,
the Vikings won their fights, sure, but in the end, they were pushed out. The records show that
yes.
while there were plenty of people who just married in and they're like, okay, we'll
Yeah.
ignore that you're a half breed, but like the purebreds were mostly kicked out and they returned back
Yeah.
to the north.
Yeah.
So it's like there's so much to be said for morale, for the training, for the getting back up and fightingness of it, that frankly, the in a time of extreme war like it was during Arthur's historical time, ignoring whether or not he was called Arthur or something, that I could absolutely believe that he won 12 battles. And I don't
Yeah.
mean a skirmish that is kind of squinting at, no, I mean, like, let's say no less than 500 aside. Like it's a battle, a thing that everyone looks at it, even his enemies, and go, yeah, he won that battle. Because if it was like 10 skirmishes, his enemies could have gotten, yeah, he wasn't that great. There was like 200 dudes in this one, and they were just some peasant farmers angry about taxes. Big whoop. Nobody would have respected that. It doesn't build the mystique that people think it might for a tyrant or anything like that.
Yeah.
Everyone knows and recognizes it what it is. Like there's some tropes that it's like, oh, people just didn't talk about those days. No, people were bored in the Dark Ages, quote unquote Dark Ages. They
I
gossiped.
like that
They
phrase.
gossiped all the time.
Having had to research into that period, I
Mm.
am fully on board with calling it the Dark Ages. There is so little hard fact for what went on between about 400 AD to about
Oh yeah.
800 AD. It's like, yep, you can call it the early medieval period. It's like, okay, go try to write even an article on a factual event that happened in that time frame.
Yes.
there's no hard information about anything, just about.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
so
It's a
to
very
be clear,
term.
if you're using the term Dark Ages to mean that there's very little hard historical data, you're absolutely correct. Like, that's a valid, and that's how it started, right? Like,
right.
that's the original usage of the term. The problem is that, people don't really look into the original use of the term. They hear the term Dark Ages, they hear dark, think backwards, and then it becomes the backwards era, which
Yeah.
is not true. Uh, that at the very least, it's misleading.
Yes.
In reality, it was an era of extreme change. So
Yeah.
people weren't very interested in keeping records. They were more
Yeah.
interested in, survival. Uh,
Yeah.
like,
Right.
and the monasteries were the ones that were kind of holding up and writing down what they could.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and plenty of those burned. So it's like, even
mhm.
if I firmly believe that even though it wouldn't be as much as people might like, there's still a ton of information out there that's available that was just simply burned by the Vikings,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Muslim raiders, or pick your barbarian poison.
Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
like there's this famous story where it was just after the siege of Hyderabad, and the general, one of the all conquering first generations of the Muslim hordes, basically wrote back to the caliph and said, "Okay, we captured this gigantic library. It has so many books, hundreds of thousands of books. What should we do with it?" Well, if it's in the Quran, we don't need it, so you can burn it. And if it's not in the Quran, well, we don't need it, so you can burn it.
Oh, oh, that
So
just hurts in my soul.
it's like for India, like that, because that's where Hyderabad is. It's in what we
Okay.
call India now. It's like, can you like they had like there's it's like all those records were lost. So there's actually like very little information we have on India before like 1500 or so. Just didn't write anything down. And everything they did write down, like for example in Hyderabad, is just was just burned mostly by Muslims. So it's like the Danes burning it, and all of a sudden they just lose 100, even if it's as boring as ledgers of births and dates and who owns what piece of land. That's still incredibly valuable information that when combined with like legends and myth and stories and local stories and whatnot, can be incredibly important to sort of some sort of I'm saying quote unquote too much, to a true history of the region. There's a place where there's a famous knight who killed a serpent. They call it a dragon, but it's described as a serpent. And it
Yeah.
was apparently a very big, like it was bigger than a 40-foot anaconda, some sort of strange throwback. Like certain. This is from a very very long time ago. Um, like
That
a
was St. George.
thousand. Sorry.
That was St. George.
No, this is somebody different.
Okay.
He was explicitly inspired by Saint George
Okay.
in the story. So that's sort of like the timeline. Nathan Hood talks about it. If I remember, I'll send you the video. And basically the guy, he slew the dragon. Well, how did he slew the dragon? Well, he marked its territory. He waited to see. Okay, it comes out in the morning and it leaves at night. Yeah, okay. It sleeps about this after it kills a sheep. Uh huh. And he like very intelligently, chose the right time and place to ride out and slay the dragon. And it's like, okay, well, if we have the records for that, more records, more than just the town, and the town legends are fairly good. If you're a high standards kind of historical person, uh, you know, there's more to it. We could say, okay, are these people truly the descendants of him? Was there like a loss or an adoption? Or is there more information that we could take here? What can we do to make the record richer or otherwise? and I think it's I think it's a great shame that much of the Dark Ages stuff was lost.
Oh, yeah, I can only imagine. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's I made a map of Great Britain using a bunch of different sources, looking at where the army, we're looking at the Roman roads, looking at all this other stuff, trying to put as much information as I can, trying to figure out which towns were still uh, thriving at, specifically during my period. That way, I knew I didn't necessarily need it on the map, but I needed to know where these towns were. So as I'm having Parador travel from place to place, I at least know if I need to describe a place being there, or like one of my editors at one point when I'm describing a column of troops moving from one location to another, and he's asking me, what are they traveling? How are they traveling? Because you mentioned that they're using wagons. I'm like, and they're like, is it a Roman road or is it just a village trail? And there's at least a few times, because we do have evidence to show where the Roman roads were in Britain, that I can actually map that out. So there are times when I actually can specify in my book that they're using a Roman road to get from this place to this place. Um, I take a couple of small liberties, like for example, Caerleon was it was abandoned by the Romans in the, I think, early 300s. It had been occupied by the Second Legion, and it was abandoned because it was kind of far west. The Romans were mostly concentrated in the eastern half of the empire. They never quite conquered Wales, which is another reason why I
Right.
think the Arthurian myth makes a lot of sense. Like, okay, Wales, the tribes around Wales, because of how mountainous it is, they defied Rome. The Anglo Saxons never quite conquered it. The Norman kings took a long time to conquer it. So, here's this Arthur character who, when you go back to the original sources, he's out of Wales. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. If there's one place in England where there's going to be some some Romano British warlord causing problems for all these invaders, yeah, basing them out of Wales kind of makes sense.
One of the
uh,
historical stories that I wish I knew more about is something called like the Great Conspiracy. It was
oh, the
during
Great
the sorry,
Barbarian Conspiracy?
yes,
Yeah.
where like eight different forces or five or six or something like that conspired and bribed Roman officials enough to so that they could invade at the same time.
I think
And Emperor Theodosius's father put that down. Uh, under
Yeah, I think those were targets of opportunity. Where anytime there's a power vacuum, somebody's going to try to move in. So I think what happened in the 300s was just a failed version of what did end up happening after 410, and that's
yeah,
the Romans in the early 300s. They were having a lot of problems with I think maybe the Dacians or somebody. They were having trouble with people in the east and in the south. They started shifting military forces away, and that shifting of forces caused other tribes in the west to go, oh, hey, there's a target of opportunity now. So they took advantage of that. Same, like I said, the exact same thing that happened when the Romans
mm,
pulled out 410. All of a sudden, bam, you got Picts starting to invade. You got Gales starting to invade. Um, Fun story. I realized when I was researching. Are you familiar with the Disney movie Brave?
yeah.
So that guy King Fergus, um, Merida's dad, is probably based on the historical King Fergus More of Dalriada, which was the Irish Gaelic Scotty tribe uh, kingdom that started around the time that the Romans withdrew from the continent.
Ah, okay.
And that's probably why they mention when those suitors come to if you listen to it, after I found that out, I went and watched Brave again because I already liked that movie. It's funny. um, and when they had all those suitors come into the island to brag, to make their boasts, to when the chiefs were bragging their sons up, One
Yes.
of them talks about fighting Romans. Now they also mention Vikings, which is probably ahistorical, although I don't know exactly. It's like, well, I mean, there were Nordic raiders even during that time. I don't know if they were called Vikings yet, but But they do mention fighting Romans, that he defeated a Roman fleet. So I'm like, that's kind of funny. And then what was really interesting is I realized that Fergus Moore most likely existed around the same time as Arthur, and in fact, there's at least one legend of Fergus Moore either fighting with or against Arthur. So I actually do name drop Fergus Moore in my story, and just because I thought it'd be fun, I use in the conversation that mentions Fergus Moore, I describe him basically looking the way he does in the Disney movie, except I don't mention the peg leg thing.
Right.
But a big hairy dude with a big red beard,
Yep.
But
I
yeah, I
mean,
thought
that's
that was,
accurate to the people. It works.
yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, that's a safe thing to carry over. Um, Yeah, I learned so much interesting things while I was researching. It was a pain trying to figure out what kingdoms were existing, because when at the time that the Romans ruled Britain by the 300s, they had carved it up into 4, possibly 5 provinces, each with a can't think of the title offhand, but each one with a governor. Um, and then as soon as the Romans pulled out, some of those provinces kind of stayed intact for a little while. A lot of them reverted back to the tribal kingdoms that they had been before Roman rule, especially in Wales, because Wales never quite fully, Romanized anyway.
Right.
So there's so many different kingdoms. Like the first couple maps, I plugged myself into a couple of Facebook groups full of people dedicated to ancient Celt and Britain and Pictish history. And the first couple maps that I showed them, they just eviscerated it. Oh, this kingdom didn't exist at that point in time. That kingdom didn't exist. And it's like, oh my God. Finally, I only put the kingdoms that I was fairly certain existed at that point in time. But I wouldn't put borders down, because that was also, kingdoms were just for that whole 400-year period of the Dark Age, kingdoms were constantly rising, falling, merging, separating. That I just didn't even feel comfortable putting borders in and there's a lot of maps. If you get on the internet and you look up maps of kingdoms at various times, first you're going to see a lot of contradictions. Secondly, a lot of maps don't bother to do borders either, because well, we know Gododin, the heart of Gododin was in this place. We know that the heart of the kingdom of Reged was here. We know that the kingdom of Alt-Clud or Clut was north of Reged, somewhere in this area, but we don't know where the boundaries were. So I just didn't put boundaries on my map, and that annoyed the crap out of my publisher, who has a background in cartography, and he kept asking me, put the boundaries in. I'm like, I don't know where the boundaries were.
It didn't matter that much.
Yeah, I even made a point of, in response to my publisher, I made a point, because it's like, well, if he's criticized me on this, other people probably will too. So I actually have a line in my book mentioning that. It's like, man, that kingdoms are rising and falling, even within their lifetimes, that trying to definitively define borders, like, that's what a lot of the fighting was about, was defining borders. You can't define borders on a map. Like the British,
right.
that's one of the biggest. When I first was in a couple of historical Facebook groups, when I first mentioned that I wanted to write an Arthurian, that I was researching an Arthurian novel, one of the biggest pushbacks that I got was, well, there was no unified Britain at this time. So the idea of a British warlord fighting all over Britain, why would he do that? Because that means these 12 battles are they're all over Britain, as far south as I think the strongest evidence for where the Battle of Badon Hill is, it makes the most sense that it's Bath. There's a few other contenders, but Bath makes the most sense to me. Um, so as far south as Bath, as far north as the woods of Scotland. That's a huge playground in a time
Because the people I've talked to, like Nathan Hood, definitely put it in the Scottish area or south of Scotland, really, just barely south of Scotland.
you talking about Kelladon Coit, or are you talking about the Battle of Baden Hill?
Ben.
Uh, so it's my understanding, if my information is correct, Badon there was one Badon. There actually was there's a couple of sources that list Caer Badon, the city of Badon,
Mm.
because Caer was a Welsh word for basically city. So almost everything, like when Ninnius lists the 33 prominent cities of Britain in his 9th century document, it's Caer London, Caer this, Caer that, and a lot of that still exists today. Caer Leon, which in my book is 2 words, Caer Leon. Um, it's one of the 2 cities called the City of the Legion, which, by the way, City of the Legion is like Arthur's 9th battle. Um, so I've seen a couple sources that suggest that a place called Caer Badon existed. Caer Badon is believed to be a mutation of the word Bath, or that Bath is a mutation of the word Badon. That
Ah.
it went, and before it was, so it went from Bath. Before that, it was Badon. Badon. Before that, it was known by the Roman, uh, the Roman name of Aquasulis, which is the hot springs that's at Bath. That Badon, it was supposedly a word basically for the baths, referencing the baths there. And that's why eventually, after the Norman conquest, it went from Badon to Bath. That's what I have read. I kind of have to caveat everything because I don't feel comfortable stating anything in this period as absolute fact. It's all contentious. But to me, it makes sense.
Sure.
Bath, when you look at the maps, Bath is right on. In fact, most of the Arthurian battles are right along the most likely place for them, aside from the roughly, I think, 3 battles that look like they occur most likely in Scotland. It's like the Kelladon Coit, pretty much everybody agrees, is almost certainly the woods of Caledonia, i.e., Scotland.
Mm.
There's another one uh, that they believe was in Mount Agned. They believe was in Edinburgh. Is the most. That's the name that's the place that comes up the most. And there's a big mound there currently,
Yes.
Arthur's seat.
I
Um,
went to see it with a
not.
friend Nathan Hood. It's
I would love.
magnificent.
Oh, I would love to see that. Does it? You've seen it. Does it look like a battle could have occurred there?
Uh, so I mean, if we're talking like 2, 3 thousand men,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If people were like, "Oh, I'm going to do 10,000," but it's like,
No.
no, I don't know about that.
I'll
Uh,
do. I'm only going to do one very big battle, and that's going to be Baden Hill. All of my other battles are going to be less than 5,000 total. Like that's so. Like, well, case in point, the 2 battles that I use in Beyond the Wall. Uh,
mm,
on Arthur's side, there's 300 of his red dragons and 1 to 2,000 levies on his side, and then on the Pict side, you're looking at a couple thousand men.
right.
That's in the grand scheme of things, that's relatively small numbers.
Yeah, I mean, like,
So,
but it's like you're dealing not with a unified kingdom, but rather
yeah,
the desperate remains of
yes,
a former empire, and that's always to me a little bit different because otherwise it's like, well, what do you expect? Every able-bodied man with the harvest coming in to be out fighting or whatever. It's like, no. Even ignoring the fact that most men are not called to be anything like a good soldier, even if they could. It's like like what do you expect? I saw how they reacted to the Vikings, in their battles and stuff like that. The average man couldn't do anything even when he was expecting it. You do, it's
Yeah,
a it's a different thing, I think.
yeah.
Ugh.
Well, having the mentality of being willing to stand in line and fight in an enemy in melee combat is I've never had to experience it, thankfully. I've only ever been shot at, and usually by people I couldn't even see. In fact, every time I was shot at, it was people I didn't see. In fact, the first time I was ever shot at, I didn't even know I'd been shot at until I climbed out of my vehicle and we saw the bullet holes in our rucksacks that were strapped to the outside of our vehicle, and we were like, "Oh, we got shot at."
Right.
Like we heard the gunfire going off, but we didn't realize it was at us specifically.
Oh
um,
yeah.
but yeah, so Britain shattered into so many itty bitty kingdoms. So the main critique that I was getting from people who know more about this period is, okay, well, if you're going to write an historical Arthurian story, you got to come up with justification for why some Welsh warlord is going to be running up and down Britain fighting enemies that aren't even in his kingdom. He wouldn't give a crap, most likely. So I had to come up with the idea of, well, this is only occurring like 30 years after Rome's absolutely utterly collapsed. So what if a last Roman unit that was in Britain, this stayed intact, passed on their tradition to another generation. So it went from Uther being the founder of this unit, the original tribune of this unit, while they were actually fighting under Rome's banner.
Mm.
And then with the death of Uther, Arthur took over, and maybe Arthur is just that one special guy who sees the bigger picture, and he's willing to fight on behalf of all the British kingdoms against the common enemy of the Saxons, the Irish, the Picts, and he just travels up and down, and because he's fighting for all of them, they're all willing to give him a little bit of money. They're all willing to give him pawn off their younger sons, because in any kind of feudal system, and even from the medieval period earlier, almost any time in history, kingdoms had to figure out what to do with their younger sons.
Right.
So it's like, well, so if a unit like the Red Dragons existed, that would be a really convenient place to send your younger sons to get them out of your hair if you're a king. Or if you're just a nobleman looking to advance yourself through warfare, through loot and stuff like that. And I do address that in my story. So Arthur is just that one last echo of a unified England, unified Britain, that as it existed under Roman rule.
Yes.
He's willing to fight. And I even do mention that these other British kingdoms are fighting each other periodically over borders, even while Arthur is doing his thing. And I do mention that when Arthur inducts Peridor into his organization, he, along with a few other recruits, he even specifically says, "Hey, I will never ask you to fight against your own people. That is not the Red Dragon's purpose. We don't fight other Britons. We will only go to war against the invaders." So that's the premise that I set. Like I said, I set them up to be kind of a proto-knightly order. Is probably the easiest way to explain them.
Yeah. I suppose there's a question of one of the things that is foundational to the idea of Arthur is the matter of Britain and the unification of British consciousness, so to speak. How would you say that your book touches on these themes, if at all?
Well, there's definitely no unified British identity.
Mm.
That just didn't exist at this point. That doesn't exist until after Alfred the Great, like 500, almost what 500 years after? No, about 400. Or Alfred the Great is what 800s, 900s, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
800s.
it's not until Alfred the Great is one of the first people who coins the concept of Anglo-Saxons. He's one of the first people. I mean, as far as if I remember right, he's called the Great because he's essentially considered one of the first kings of England, referencing England as a single nation. So my novel definitely doesn't explore the idea of any kind of a unified Britain. It definitely references a wish for a unified Britain, a dream of a unified Britain. That is what Arthur is, I think I expressly, that is his ultimate goal, is he wants to reunify Britain the way it had been under Roman rule. Because that's, of course, the only frame of reference he would have is, well, that's what we had before. That's what we could have again. Of course, it wasn't even that unified under Roman rule all that well. Parts of it were, but the further you got from that southeast corner, the less unified it was. And that's why once the Romans left, boom, all these previously suppressed Celtic tribes reemerged, and they left the Roman cities. They reoccupied the hill forts, and a lot of them went back to living the way they had up to the point that the Romans conquered Britain in 43 AD. Yeah, about 43 AD. Yeah. So there is I express a desire for a unified Britain, but that's the closest I get to that. I do very much explore the tension between there's very much an us versus them mentality from the Red Dragons, in the sense of there's Britons and then there's all these other invaders, and we have to fight together or we will be wiped out.
Yes.
But I try to make it clear within the book that this mentality is an anomaly. That some of the people coming, like I have one character who was originally from the southern port of Portus Adernus, which was a prominent port for the Romans down in like central south. It's near the Isle of Wight, I think it is. A small island on the very southern central line of England. I mentioned a kid having come from there, being displaced by the West Saxons, and he joins the Red Dragons in the hopes that maybe one day the Britons will reoccupy the place. So that's the kind of people that the Red Dragons recruit from. But for the most part, most people are only really concerned with their own small kingdom, and they're just as likely to fight other Britons as they are the Saxons. And then on the flip side of that, I have a character who's a third generation Saxon in the story, whose grandfather came to Britain on the invitation of Vortigern as a mercenary, because the Romans were doing that in the 440s, very much so. And Vortigern infamously invited the Saxons to come fight as mercenaries to deal with the Scots in the Picts in particular, because, of course, at that point, the Saxons weren't as big of a problem. And he's the one who invited Hengist and Horsa, the famous Jute warlords. So my character of Gilbert, his grandfather came over in the 440s and fought alongside of Hengist and Horsa on behalf of the British king Vortigern. So he's very insulted and angry when some of these other Welsh soldiers are criticizing him, like, oh, you're a Saxon dog and all. So he's like, hey, my grandfather shed blood fighting Picts on behalf of the people of this island. How am I not just as much British as you?
Well, maybe Hengist and Horsa should have thought of that when they murdered a bunch of people. But the
After a 20-year war,
sure,
where they were getting jerked around between what land are you going to get, what land are you not.
sure.
Vortigern made all kinds of promises. Oh, I'm not saying Hengist and Horsa are totally innocent, but
Yeah,
I will say, let me put it this way: after I do the Peridor trilogy, I'm gonna start. I'm gonna rewind the clock to the 420s and start a story with Arthur's grandfather, a character named Constantine, who's mentioned in quite a bit of detail by Geoffrey of Monmouth.
yeah,
Constantine's going to set himself up in the kingdom of Dumnonia, which is modern day Cornwall, at Tintagel, because Tintagel, has a long tradition of being connected to Arthur. From the city of Tintagel, he's going to come into conflict. Constantine is going to come into conflict with Vortigern's grandfather, a guy named Vitellinus,
yeah.
and which is a name that's also shown up a few times in historical record. Although some people think that Vitellinus, Vortigern may just be variations of the same name, I'm treating them as separate because
Yeah.
it works for my story.
That's what matters.
Yeah.
It's
So Constantine.
I gotta ask, Anthony, are you still around? Are you okay?
Oh, I'm still here, but yeah. I don't want to interrupt the flow of the discussion without something concrete to add.
No, I dig it. No, okay. I just wanted to make sure you were still around. Yeah, no. With when it comes to things like that, I'm like more and more after what I've seen in my own life and sort of around us thanks to the internet. It's like, yeah, no, I'm okay with it. Like the Anglo Saxons were the invaders. Yeah, they were brought in and hired and stuff like that for
Yeah.
hired as mercenaries and stuff like that. But so was Alaric the Goth. Like
Romans screwed that guy over hard
oh
too.
yeah, I'm not even saying that some of the battles were unjustified, but it's like yeah, no, actually, you know what? I firmly believe that there's a difference between the native. Listen, look. I don't want to sound like some sort of Breton Roman supremacist, okay? But listen, I've been listening to Alex's Jonesius, and Britain for the Bretons. But you know, it, looking back at this stuff, and this is a thought that's only formulating in my mind now as I'm moving my mouth gaper. It's that the it's the sort of like the same problem over and over and over again.
Yeah,
And maybe we actually had a period of time when there was actually very minimal migration of people.
I think
Uh,
so.
and so it's like we're actually moving into we've been moved. We are in the middle of a period of time when there is massive migration of people. And now we're feeling something that they themselves would feel and understand.
Yeah,
But they chose a path. I don't think the people of Britain have the courage in their hearts for it this time. But maybe it will be revived in them.
yeah.
Um, and maybe stories like this can sort of help revive that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
so I'm trying not to inject. I think I've done a good job, and nobody's critiqued me on it yet. Of all the people who have test read it, either for editing or just to be able to give me a review when it comes out. But I very much tried not to inject any modern politics into the story. There are definitely issues that Arthur and his men are facing in Beyond the Wall that will definitely resonate with issues today. What's fine line between an invader and an immigrant and an
mm,
colonizer? There's a fine line between the difference of those three things, and that's a very relevant issue that's happening today. I'd say that's very relevant to what was going on in post-Roman Britain. So there is a connection there, but at the same time, it's not like there's going to be a warlord named Trumpius or
right.
something in there. I'm not. I did everything well, I didn't have to try very hard, but I don't believe that I injected any modern politics
Yeah.
into my story.
Well, how much politics is modern? Yeah, it's like yeah, and if I had a suspicion of that, I just wouldn't let you on the show. At least unless they agreed with my politics. Because I don't believe in being objective here. So subjectivity is ordained by God, quite frankly. Uh, these things here that we discuss and that we could discuss, but we don't really have time for, are the perennial problem, immortal stories that are worth talking about again and again
Yeah,
and again. And it seems to me that Arthur is in a little bit of an upswing. Not the same way that what's something that entered the zeitgeist suddenly, like the
Joan of
Odyssey.
Arc, Joan of Arc came back into play in World War I when the French needed a hero.
Yes.
Uh, Arthur, yeah, he's another one of those figures, like you just said. Yeah, I don't him. He pops up when the British need an old hero to rally behind. Boudica's another one, even
Yes.
though she's kind of overhyped.
She
I never
is.
really thought about it much until I had a conversation about her. James Mace actually skipped her, and I emailed him about that. I was like, surprised. I was like, wow, you're telling a really detailed story about a Roman family participating in all these key events throughout Roman history, but you skipped the Boudica Rebellion. And he's like, why? She fought like two main battles, got her butt kicked by a much smaller Roman force, and it's been covered enough times that I just didn't even feel like I needed to.
You're certainly right about that.
And I thought about that. It's like, yeah, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
What
But
I find
yeah, keep going.
what I find most fascinating about her story is that she had burned like three different Roman cities to the ground, to include London. Had she won that battle of Watling Street, she might have evicted the Romans completely out of Britain, because there weren't that many Roman legions in Britain at that point. There was like three legions
Yes.
scattered around. She mostly defeated the Ninth Legion in bits and pieces. The Second Legion refused to come out of their fort for whatever reason. When the governor in Britain summoned them, the Second Legion, despite their great reputation under Vespasian in the invasion, the Second Legion said, "Nah, we're good." So it was only, I can't remember which legion ultimately. There was bits and pieces of like two different legions that fought Boudica,
Mm,
but she had a much bigger force. Like, man, if she had won,
right.
Emperor Emperor Nero might have just said, you know what, Britain's just not worth the trouble.
Right. I dig it. Uh, yeah. So we are at our final minutes here. I think
Okay.
we've had a really great stream. Why don't you give us a little bit of a final word, and then I'll close us out.
Well, buy my book. It's a great Arthurian story. It's historical fiction, but it still stays true to Arthurian lore. I think I straddled that great thin line between um, it completely ignoring established Arthurian lore, especially the early part of the myth, while also not going against known historical fact about the period.
Nice. That's pretty impressive. Anthony, do you have anything to say in our final minute?
I'm looking forward to this. I've liked the way that you've described it, the pitch you've given on the show. It sounds like a very intriguing story. Like I said, I think that the world of Arthuriana is a very broad one. There is a place for these sorts of historical based stories. And even though, yeah, the way that I've written them and the way that I view it, I'm very much a kid. And Ben has kind of hinted at this as well in discussions in this discussion, even like very much I'm a kitchen sink approach kind of guy to the Arthurian legends,
Mm,
where it's like, if it if it seems plausible when you're reading it, that's good enough for me, right? And that's kind of the level that I'm looking for, which is sort of Mallory, right? That's Mallory.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Mallory doesn't make really any sense, but nobody cares, right? However, I think that the world of Arthurian fiction is a very broad one. There is definitely a place for this. And what I appreciate about it is that a lot of the times when people do these, you're being I'm trying to think of the word. Ben mentioned we don't like the word realist here, but I'm going to use it in a very strict sense. Like you're being realist without telling us, oh, and by the way, heroes can't exist, right? Like
Not
the
deconstruct.
real, the real Arthur was gritty and morally gray. Like that I wouldn't read. Right. I would just
Right.
say I'm
Yeah.
not interested.
There are morally gray characters, like
Oh
I
yeah.
do that with Owain. He's kind of a scary dude. But Arthur, no, I want. Like, I wrote this story, especially the Parador Saga. I wrote it for my son. I firmly believe. I hate those movies that deconstruct heroes. I hate that.
Yes.
So I
Yeah,
wanted.
that's what I'm getting at.
I wanted Arthur within a realistic setting. I wanted him to still be. He's very much like the Clive Owen Arthur. He has a very strong sense of justice. He is a Christian. There is a lot of Christian themes in the book because they're Romano Britons. Saints are popping up left and right. They
Hmm.
very much are in a Christian culture. There's some Celtic pagan echoes. I explore that a little bit when they celebrate the Samhain. And you can see the transition from pagan to Christian. But Arthur is still he's the kind of hero, I try to write him the kind of hero that I would be more than happy with my son viewing as a hero. Same with the character of Parador. He's young and naive. So he has a little bit of a culture shock around characters like Owain who have to explain why things are the way they are. Um, so I definitely make them heroic, very strongly moral characters, but they're also ruthless warriors who fight to win battles, knowing that if they lose, they them and everybody they love will die if they don't win. So
Yes.
they do still have to face that reality.
Very good.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's why, yeah, you, that's why I'm still very interested in reading this book because rooting it in a historical reality is all well and good, but
Yeah.
deconstructing the heroism of the story is something that it
Oh
cannot
yeah.
be abided.
Uh,
And it sounds like you're very, very, very not interested in doing that.
no. I even tested a scene out with again James Mace, who's spent the last 20 years writing Roman history, and I sent him a scene where Arthur confronts a picked barbarian in a certain circumstance. And I'm like, this doesn't seem too modern in terms of like him being too nice, does he? And James Mace responded, he's like, oh no. I was like, he's he's as ruthless as he is in this scene. In the context of his time, this would be very progressive of him to do. And I was like, yes, that's what I'm going for. I want him to be the kind of idealistic, moral compass that can inspire everybody around them while at the same time not have him be so moral by today's standards that he just wouldn't even fit in with the context of his time, the time and place that he's in. You know what I mean?
Yep, exactly.
So yeah, there was a lot of lines that I was trying to balance out between Arthurian myth, being true to the Arthurian myth, while also being true to what could have happened historically, making Arthur a strong, moral, heroic character, while at the same time making him somebody you really would not want to face on the battlefield. um,
Good stuff.
and there's
Uh,
even a female character in there that I made her very intelligent, very spunky, but also still very feminine. She's not the modern girl boss character.
Oh, good. Uh, yeah, no, we'll don't have time enough in the world to for that one.
Yeah.
No, as we close out today, these sort of stories are very important for us to follow and support. These things have to be told and retold to keep them in the moment, not in the sense of Emily Wilson's death bringing, horrible, no good, terrible translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad, but rather in the sense of making sure that, especially with uh, 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 excuse me, especially with Jason saying, he's writing this for his son. You know, will our sons have the same stories as we did? And I didn't have as much as people might have had, 50 years ago. And I know they tended to have less than the people who grew up during the turn of the century. We must make sure these things are preserved and brought on and brought forward to the next generation. From what I hear for the Zoomers, they're absolutely in Gen Alpha, they're absolutely crying out for any sort of figure that will not justify them, but rather treat them as a human being, especially the white men.
Oh yes.
So it's one of those things where these stories we can certainly support. I like what I've heard. I like what I read. And the more we put them out, the weightier our side becomes, because culture is not about just some sort of singular point, but rather the whole of the culture, the movement of it, into a singular point, a point that stretches out and maybe even someday will lead us to the stars. But for now, the sense of identity, the sense of Britain, the matter of Britain will be enough. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. I had fun.
Excellent. And the stream is done.
All right.